My daughter-in-law told me I had 90 days to sign over my house, or she'd make sure I never saw my grandkids again. She said it standing in my kitchen, holding a mug I'd bought for my wife 30 years ago like she owned it already. My son stood behind her and studied the floor tiles. I set down my coffee, and I smiled. What she didn't know was that I'd already spoken to a lawyer 3 weeks earlier, and that the deed to that house had a name on it she'd never once thought to check. Welcome back, family. Tell me where you're watching from tonight. I read every comment. And before we start, know this. Some details here are shaped for the telling, but what this story leaves in you is real. It was a Thursday evening in early spring when Denise walked into my kitchen without knocking, the way she'd started doing about a year back. Like the knock was a formality she'd outgrown. My son, Robert, came in behind her, hands jammed in his jacket pockets, eyes doing that thing they'd done more and more lately, landing on everything in the room except me. I was standing at the stove, finishing a pot of coffee, the same blue percolator I'd had since Carol was alive, and I heard the front door open and close, and I knew before I turned around that this wasn't a social visit. Denise set her purse on the counter like she was staking a claim to it. She picked up the mug from the drying rack, Carol's mug, the one with the chipped handle and the faded painting of a lighthouse, filled it without asking, and leaned against my counter like she'd done it 100 times, though she never had. Not once in the 11 years she'd been married to my son. "Walter," she said, "we need to have a conversation. A real one." I turned the burner off. "About what?" "About the house." She said it simply, like she was asking about the weather. "About what makes sense going forward." I looked at Robert. He was 51 years old, my only child, and in that moment he looked exactly like he had at 7, the time he broke Carol's reading lamp and let me take the blame rather than open his mouth. "Robert," I said, "you want to be part of this conversation, or you just here for the coffee?" He shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "Dad, just hear her out." Denise didn't wait for an invitation. She pulled a folded packet of papers out of her bag, not a folder, just papers, rubber banded together like she hadn't thought this needed to look official, because in her mind it already was. "You're 74. You're alone in a 4-bedroom house you can barely keep heated. Robert and I have talked about this for months. It makes sense for us to move in, for you to sign the house over to Robert now instead of waiting on a will, and for you to take the guest room. It's better for everyone, especially the kids." There it was. The kids. She always led with the kids last, dropped in at the end like a period at the close of a sentence, because she knew that was the one lever in this house she could still pull on me. I want to tell you plainly, before I go further, that this did not come out of nowhere. I want to tell you how a house I built, with my own 2 hands, room by room, over 19 years with my wife, ended up being talked about in my own kitchen, like a used car somebody wanted to flip. You have to understand who Denise was when she first arrived in our lives. 12 years ago, she was 26, sharp, good with people, the kind of woman who remembered your birthday and sent a card that arrived exactly on time. Carol liked her immediately. I was slower to warm, not because of anything she did, but because I'd learned by then that people who are that polished that fast are usually working from a script, and I wanted to see what happened when the script ran out. For the first few years, nothing did. She was good to Robert, good to us, brought her A-game to every holiday. Then Carol got sick, pancreatic, diagnosed on a Tuesday in October, gone by the following June, and something in the family's whole architecture shifted. The way a house settles differently after you take a wall out. Denise was helpful during those months, genuinely. I'll give her that. She drove Carol to 2 appointments I couldn't make. She sat with her the day I had to fly out for my brother's funeral. I owed her something for that, and for a long time I let that debt cloud what came after. What came after was slow. It's always slow. That's the thing nobody tells you about being pushed out of your own family. It doesn't happen in a single afternoon. It happens over 3 or 4 years, one small redirection at a time, until one day, you look up, and you're standing outside a house that used to be yours in every sense of the word. It started with the grandkids. Maya was 11 when Carol died. Dylan was 8. For the first year after, I saw them constantly Sunday dinners, school pickups when Robert's schedule got tight. The 2 weeks every summer they'd stay with me at the lake cabin. Carol and I bought the year Robert graduated college. Denise handled the scheduling for the family, which made sense. She was organized. Robert wasn't. Nobody thought twice about it. But slowly those Sunday dinners became let's do it every other week, and then let's see how the kids' schedules look, and then they mostly stopped altogether. replaced by a birthday card and a phone call that Denise would hover near, redirecting the conversation whenever it ran long. With Maya, she was gentle about it. Little comments, dropped like seeds. "Grandpa's been forgetting things lately, hasn't he?" said with a soft, worried face, not to me, but to Maya, in front of me, like I wasn't standing right there. "He gets confused sometimes, sweetheart. It's not his fault, it's just age." I watched my granddaughter's face change over about 2 years, watched her go from running to hug me at the door to standing a half step behind her mother, studying me like I was something that might need managing. With Dylan, she didn't bother with doubt. She just used exclusion. Baseball practice that used to be my job to drive him to got quietly reassigned. Family trips got planned around dates she knew conflicted with my schedule, then re-explained afterward as unfortunate timing. By the time Dylan was 13, he'd built a version of me in his head assembled entirely from what his mother chose to show him, and none of it was false. Exactly, it was just curated down to almost nothing. I want to be honest with you about something, because I think it matters for what comes later. I saw all of this happening. I am not a fool, and I was not blind. I saw the seeds being planted and I let them grow, because I told myself I was keeping the peace, because Robert seemed happy, because I didn't want to be the bitter old man making a scene at Thanksgiving, and because some part of me, the part still raw from losing Carol, was terrified of losing my son too, and I mistook staying quiet for staying close. That was my mistake and I own it, and I'll come back to it before this story is done. The house conversation had actually been building for close to 3 years, I found out later. Not the 90 days Denise made it sound like when she finally said it out loud. There'd been small comments before this remarks about how big the house was for one person, how much upkeep it needed, how it might make more sense for the family to consolidate. I'd waved them off as the kind of thing people say without meaning much by it. I was wrong about that too. What finally moved things from comments to a packet of papers on my counter was money. Robert's business, a small commercial landscaping company he'd built up over about 15 years, had taken a hard hit the previous winter. A contract with the city fell through. Equipment financing came due at a bad time, and by February they were, according to what I pieced together later, about 4 months from serious trouble. My house, paid off in full since 2009, sitting on a lot that had appreciated considerably as the neighborhood filled in around it, was worth, conservatively, close to $500,000. To Denise, that wasn't my home. That was collateral sitting idle. "I'm not signing anything tonight," I told her, in my kitchen, that Thursday evening, keeping my voice even. "Nobody's asking you to sign it tonight," she said, and smiled the particular smile she used when she wanted something to sound reasonable. "We're just starting the conversation. But Walter, I need you to understand this isn't really optional. Robert and I have discussed it. If this doesn't happen, we're going to have to seriously reconsider how much time the kids spend around you. It's not a threat. It's just at your age. Unpredictability isn't good for children. We need stability. We need to know what's coming." I looked at my son. "Robert, is that what you want? To use my grandchildren as leverage on a house?" He finally looked up. "Dad, it's not nobody's using anybody. Denise is just trying to think ahead for the family." "For the family," I repeated. "Or for the business?" Something flickered across Denise's face, there and gone, and I knew I'd landed closer to the truth than she wanted. "That's not fair," she said. "No," I said. "It isn't. 90 days, you said." I said, "It makes sense to move quickly." I nodded slowly. I did not raise my voice. I did not slam a hand on the counter, though something old and furious was waking up in me for the first time in years. I picked my coffee back up, and I said the only thing I could think to say in that moment that was both true and useful. "All right, let me think about it." She looked almost disappointed that I hadn't fought harder, right there, in the kitchen. People like Denise plan for resistance. They don't always know what to do with quiet. What she did not know, what none of them knew, is that 11 days before that conversation, I had already been sitting in the office of a woman named Patricia Alvarez, an elder law attorney 2 towns over, a name given to me by Ruth, the hospice nurse who'd cared for Carol in her last 6 weeks, and who I'd stayed in touch with, mostly out of gratitude, mostly by accident, in the way certain people stay stitched into your life long after the reason they entered it is gone. I hadn't gone to Patricia because I suspected the specific conversation that would happen in my kitchen. I'd gone because 6 months earlier, at a birthday dinner for Dylan that I almost wasn't invited to, I'd overheard, not eavesdropped. Overheard. There's a difference. The kitchen door was open and my hearing isn't what it once was, but it isn't gone either. Denise on the phone with someone, saying the words, "once were on the deed," in a tone that had nothing casual about it. I didn't confront her that night. I went home, and I sat in my armchair, the one Carol picked out, and I thought about what kind of man I wanted to be for whatever years I had left. Patricia and I spent that first meeting mostly on background. She asked me questions I hadn't thought to ask myself: how the house was titled, whether Carol's name was still on the deed in a way that mattered, whether I had a current will, a healthcare proxy, a power of attorney designated to someone I trusted. The answer to most of those was no, and that alone should tell you something about how comfortable I'd let myself become, how much I'd let inertia stand in for protection. Here is the detail Denise never thought to check. Because why would she? The house had been left to Carol and me jointly by her father in 1997, before Robert was even out of college, back when the neighborhood was still half farmland. When Carol died, under the terms of that original deed and the trust her father had set up alongside it, a trust I'd forgotten the specifics of, if I'm honest. Until Patricia pulled the paperwork, the house didn't simply become mine outright to dispose of however I liked in my final years. A portion of it, structured as a life estate, with specific remainder provisions, was already earmarked, upon my death or voluntary transfer, to go not to Robert directly, but into an educational trust for Carol's grandchildren, Maya and Dylan, administered independently of whoever held the deed day to day. Carol's father, it turned out, had been a careful man who didn't entirely trust how the next generation would handle money, and he'd built a structure that Robert, and certainly Denise, had never bothered to read past the cover page, which meant that any attempt to pressure me into signing the house directly over to Robert now, outside of that trust structure, wasn't simply premature or unkind. Depending on how it was executed, it could constitute an attempt to circumvent a legally binding trust provision, something Patricia was very clear, carried real consequences if a court determined it had been done knowingly, under pressure, against the interests of the trust's beneficiaries. Denise wanted the house. Denise did not know the house, did not, entirely, belong to me to give. Over those 90 days, I did exactly what Denise expected, a tired, aging, easily managed man to do. I went quiet. I stopped pushing back at family dinners. I let comments about my memory, my energy, my confusion pass without correction, even when they stung. Even the time Denise mentioned to Maya, in front of me, that she'd found the stove left on twice that month, which was true exactly once, and which I'd caught and fixed myself, alone, the way I'd caught and fixed most things alone for the 4 years since Carol died. What I was actually doing, during those 90 days, was building a file. I kept a small notebook, the kind you'd use for a grocery list, and I wrote down dates, the night Denise moved Carol's mug without asking, the Tuesday she told Maya I got confused sometimes, the specific wording of the 90 days conversation, written down that same night while it was still fresh, word for word as close as memory allowed. I went back to Patricia twice more, and on her advice, I had a private conversation with my primary doctor, requesting a full cognitive evaluation not because I doubted myself, but because I understood, with a clarity that surprised me, that the fastest way to protect myself from being quietly declared incapable was to have an unimpeachable, current, professional record proving exactly how capable I was. The results came back completely clean. I kept the paperwork in a fireproof box in my closet, next to Carol's wedding ring. And then there was Dylan. Dylan was 15 that year, and something had shifted in him over the past several months that I hadn't fully understood until it was almost over. Where Maya had absorbed her mother's doubts quietly, folding them into how she saw me, Dylan had started doing something else entirely. He'd started noticing the gap between what his mother said about me and what he actually observed when he was around me, which by then was rare, but not never. 3 separate times that spring, Denise had forgotten to mention family gatherings to me, only for Dylan to find out afterward and, apparently, ask his mother why. 3 separate times he'd gotten an answer that didn't quite hold together. I didn't know any of this at the time. I found it out the way I found out most things that mattered that spring because Ruth, the hospice nurse, was still, unbeknownst to anyone, a thread connecting parts of this family that had otherwise gone quiet with each other. Ruth had run into Dylan at the community center where she volunteered on weekends, recognized him from photos Carol used to show her, and they'd gotten to talking. Teenagers tell nurses things they don't tell parents. Sometimes, especially nurses who ask good questions and don't act shocked by the answers. Dylan told Ruth he thought something was wrong, that his mom talked about Grandpa's house like it already belonged to them, that he didn't understand why he wasn't allowed to just call me anymore without it being a whole conversation first. Ruth called me that same week. That call is the reason the next part of this story happened the way it did. I want to slow down here, because this is the part of the story that still catches in my throat a little when I tell it, even now. I asked Ruth, carefully, if she thought it would be all right for me to reach out to Dylan directly, without going through Robert or Denise. She said she thought the boy would welcome it. So I did something I hadn't done in over a year. I sent my grandson a text message, just a few words, asking if he wanted to grab a burger sometime, just the two of us. No big production. He wrote back within 4 minutes. 4 minutes, after more than a year of near silence. That told me almost everything I needed to know about how much of that silence had actually come from him, versus how much had been built around him. We met at a diner 2 towns over, somewhere Denise wouldn't think to look, not because I was hiding exactly, but because I didn't want that lunch interrupted or reported back on before it had even happened. Dylan looked older than 15 sitting across from me in that booth, the way kids do sometimes when they've been carrying something too heavy for their age. He didn't waste time on small talk. "Grandpa, is Mom trying to get you to give her the house?" I set my fork down. "What makes you ask that?" I heard her on the phone with Dad's business partner. She said something about once the house transfers like it's already happening. And she keeps telling Maya stuff about you forgetting things, but you don't forget things, Grandpa. You remembered my birthday. You remembered I switched from soccer to track. You remember stuff Mom doesn't even remember. He looked down at his plate. I don't think it's true what she says. I think she just wants you to seem like you need managing. I sat with that for a moment, because hearing a 15-year-old articulate, with more clarity than half the adults in this story, exactly what had been happening to me for 3 years, is not a small thing. "Dylan," I said, "I need you to understand something, and I need you to understand it's not about choosing sides. Your mother loves your father. I believe that. People can love someone and still make choices, under enough pressure, that aren't right. I'm not asking you to be angry at her. I'm asking you if you'd be willing to help me make sure the truth is on the record, in case it's ever needed. Nothing dishonest, nothing behind anyone's back that you'd be ashamed of. Just the truth, written down, in your own words, dated, in case a day comes when it matters." He didn't hesitate. "What do you need me to do?" Over the following 7 weeks, without Denise or Robert ever knowing, Dylan kept a simple, dated, log comments he overheard. Conversations about the house, the specific things his mother said to Maya about my memory that he knew, firsthand, to be exaggerated or false. He wasn't spying in any elaborate way. He was a kid living in his own house, paying closer attention than anyone gave him credit for, and writing down what he saw. Patricia later told me that log, corroborated by my clean cognitive evaluation and my own dated notes, turned out to be one of the more persuasive pieces of the whole picture, precisely because it came from someone with no adult motive to shade it one way or the other. Maya, meanwhile, remained mostly outside of this, and I want to say clearly, that was intentional. She was younger, closer to her mother, and I did not want to put her in the position of choosing a side she wasn't ready to choose. But near the very end of those 90 days, something happened that told me even Maya's doubts weren't as settled as Denise believed. I'd gone to drop off a birthday present at Robert and Denise's house. Maya was turning 14, and I'd found, after considerable effort, a signed copy of a novel by an author she'd mentioned loving, months earlier, in one of our increasingly rare phone calls. Denise wasn't home. Maya answered the door, took the gift, and then, before I could say much of anything, she reached into her jacket pocket and pressed a folded piece of paper into my hand. "Don't open it here," she whispered. I read it in my car in the driveway. In her handwriting, unsteady in the way handwriting is when someone is being careful and scared at the same time, it said, "I don't think you're confused, Grandpa. I'm sorry I believed her. I miss you." I sat in that car for a long time before I could drive home. 90 days came and went. Denise called a family meeting her words. "Family meeting," said with the weight of an official proceeding for a Sunday afternoon, at my house, which she'd apparently decided was appropriate, given that, in her mind, the transfer of ownership was a formality still in progress, rather than a request that had gone entirely unanswered. I invited Patricia to attend, informally, as what I described to Robert only as a friend, helping me understand my options. Denise's face, when Patricia introduced herself properly at the door and it became clear exactly what kind of friend she was, told me everything about how confident she'd been that this would go the way she'd planned it. Walter, I think it's a bit much to bring a lawyer to a family conversation, Denise said. Once we were all seated in my living room, the same living room Carol and I had put together 30 years earlier, one piece of furniture at a time. I think it's exactly enough, I said. Given that 90 days ago I was told, in this house, that if I didn't sign over ownership, I might lose access to my grandchildren. That's not a family conversation, Denise. That's a demand with a deadline. That's not what I said. I wrote down what you said, the same night, word for word. The word. I watched something shift in her face, the first real crack I'd seen in 3 years of careful composure. Here is what's actually true, I continued, keeping my voice level, the way I'd practiced saying this in front of my bathroom mirror more times than I'd admit. This house isn't fully mine to give away the way you've been assuming it is. A portion of it is bound, by a trust your husband has apparently never read, to pass eventually to Maya and Dylan directly, for their education, regardless of who holds the deed day to day. Any attempt to move it into your and Robert's names outright, under pressure, ahead of that trust, would very likely be challengeable in court, and I have, at this point, extensive documentation of exactly the kind of pressure that's been applied. Dated notes. A clean cognitive evaluation from my doctor, taken specifically because I suspected someone might one day try to suggest otherwise. And Denise, I know about the comments to Maya, about my memory, about the stove. Dylan, I said, turning, would you be comfortable sharing what you've kept these past weeks? My grandson, sitting a little straighter than I'd seen him sit in over a year, opened a folder, an actual folder, his own idea, not mine, and set it on the coffee table, not slammed down. Just set there, plainly, the way you set down something true. Robert finally spoke, his voice smaller than I'd heard it in decades. Denise, what is he talking about? It's not what it sounds like, she started. I heard you, Dylan said quietly, and it was the first time all afternoon he'd spoken directly to his mother instead of to me. I heard you on the phone in February. You said once the house transfers. You've been telling Maya stuff about Grandpa that isn't true. I wrote it all down because I didn't think anyone would believe me otherwise. Denise looked around the room, at her husband, at her son holding a folder, at her daughter sitting very still on the couch, at Patricia's calm, professional silence, and I watched her realize, in real time, that the story she'd spent 3 years building, the useful, agreeable version of events where a tired old man slowly, understandably faded, and needed managing, had just come apart in front of the only witnesses whose word actually mattered. I did not raise my voice, not once, through any of it. I want you to understand that, because I think it matters. This wasn't about humiliating her in front of my family, though I won't pretend some old wounded part of me didn't want exactly that for one hot second. This was about the truth finally being allowed to stand where it should have been standing all along. I'm not signing the house over, I said, once the room had gone quiet. Not now. Not under this kind of pressure. Maybe not ever. And that's my right. What I am willing to do because, despite everything, Robert is still my son, and Maya and Dylan are still my grandchildren. And none of this changes how much I love this family is sit down with Patricia and put together an actual estate plan, one that's fair, one that protects the kids' education the way Carol's father intended, one that isn't decided under threat in my own kitchen on a Thursday evening. Robert, for the first time in longer than I could remember, looked at his wife instead of the floor. You told him he'd lose the kids if he didn't sign? Robert, I was trying to protect this family. By threatening my father with his own grandchildren? I won't walk you through every minute of what happened in my living room after that, because some of it belongs to them now, not to this story. What I'll tell you is that it was not loud, and it was not fast, and it did not end with anyone storming out in the way you might expect. Robert asked Denise to leave the room, so he could speak with me, alone. Patricia stepped out to give us privacy, and for the first time in 3 years, my son sat across from me, in the house he grew up in, and told me he was sorry, not in the vague, glancing way people apologize when they mostly want the discomfort to end, but specifically, for every dinner he'd let slide, every comment about my memory he hadn't corrected, Every time he'd chosen the path of least resistance in his own marriage at the cost of his relationship with his father. I told him what I'm telling you now. I told him that I understood, better than he knew, how easy it is to mistake keeping the peace for keeping the people you love safe. I told him I'd made that exact mistake myself, for years, with Carol, in ways I never got the chance to fully make right before she was gone. I told him it wasn't too late for him. It had almost been too late for me. It's been 8 months since that Sunday afternoon. Things are not perfect, I want to be honest with you about that, because too many of these stories end wrapped up too neatly, and that's not quite true to life. Denise and Robert are in counseling, together, which I think is a good sign, though what happens with their marriage isn't mine to predict or control. The business made it through its rough patch, eventually, through means that had nothing to do with my house. Patricia and I finished the estate plan properly, fair, transparent, with everyone's role written down in plain language nobody has to guess at anymore. Maya calls me most Sundays now, on her own, without being reminded. Dylan and I still get burgers most months, just the two of us, and we don't talk about any of it anymore mostly. We talk about track season, and a girl he likes, and whether the Cubs have any chance this year. I go out to Carol's grave sometimes, still, on quiet evenings, and I tell her about all of it, about the folder Dylan set down on the coffee table, about the note Maya pressed into my hand in the driveway, about the 90 days I spent smiling and staying quiet while I built, piece by piece, the only kind of shield I knew how to build. I think she'd have been proud of how it ended, though I think she also would have told me, gently, the way she used to tell me things, that I let it go on far too long before I did anything about it. She'd have been right. If there's one thing I want you to carry out of this story with you, it isn't that I won, or that I was clever, or that I finally had the paperwork on my side when it mattered. It's this: do not wait until you're standing in your own kitchen being told what's about to be taken from you before you decide you're worth protecting. I waited. I told myself I was being patient, being kind, keeping the peace, and what I was actually doing was leaving myself and the people I loved without a shield for far longer than I should have. I believe certain people find their way into your life at exactly the moment you need them, whether you notice it happening or not. Ruth, still checking in on this family years after her job here was finished. Dylan, quiet and watchful in a way nobody gave him credit for. Maya, brave enough to slip a note into an old man's hand and whisper, "Don't open it here." None of that, I've come to believe, was an accident. This is what real family justice looks like, in my experience. It isn't loud, and it doesn't happen in a single dramatic scene. It's a 15-year-old boy with a notebook and 7 weeks of quiet attention. It's a nurse who remembered a family long after there was any reason left to. It's an old man who finally stopped mistaking his own silence for strength. If any part of this story found something true in you, if you've ever been the one people assumed was too old, too tired, or too far past his prime to stand up for himself, tell me about it in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from tonight. Share this with someone in your life who's been quiet for far too long, because sometimes the people who need to hear that it isn't too late are exactly the people scrolling past a story like this one, alone, at the end of a long day. And if you believe, like I do, that the truth finds its way to the surface, eventually, whether we help it along or not, stay with this channel, because there are more stories like mine, waiting to be told. To everyone who stayed until this very last word, thank you. Carol would have liked every one of you. This has been a father who finally remembered his own worth. And this is what family justice looks like when it finally arrives. Quiet, patient, and exactly on time.